It is easier, if not easy, to explore a topic when the intention is to converge the conversation to a conclusion. It's, however, quite interesting when you try to explore a topic and one knows that there is no convergence in sight. I've been having a few discussions around one such topic quite often these days. How cybersecurity in general and application security in particular is increasingly becoming what is called a many-body or an n-body problem in physics. In celestial mechanics, to be precise. Now, I'm blatantly and somewhat inaccurately borrowing concepts from physics, but I do think that this is a good way to understand the cybersecurity world around us. Today, every software system is a complex composition of multiple subsystems, and every software system is more likely than not a participant in an orchestration of multiple systems. Simply put, software systems and the way they interact with each other make them subjects of a many-body problem, where it becomes virtually impossible to predict the universe of interactions that are exerted between these software systems. Now, let me get to the point here. How do we then protect such systems? In a way, the SolarWinds episode was a textbook example of how connected systems are vulnerable in more ways than we can predict. For the most part, SolarWinds was on the infrastructure plane. Now, could we expect a SolarWinds-like issue on the application plane? After all, applications today represent a many-body problem, and there is no way for us to predict the universe of interactions between the applications that are now connected in a complex supply chain through a wide variety of integrations, from database-centric integrations to public API-based integrations and everything in between.
Welcome to White Hat Security's AppSec Stats Flash, the monthly podcast on the state of application security. Hosted by Setu Kulkarni with analysis from White Hat's in-house security expert, Zach Jones. Today's special guest is Dino Boucouris, founding director at Momentum Cyber.
To discuss these topics, I'm joined today by Zach Jones, with whom I'll hope to take a deep dive into what our application security data tells us and what are some of the things we could do to address the supply chain related risks to applications that are strung together in many different ways today. And in the second half of today's podcast, I'll be joined by Dino Boucouris, a founding director at Momentum Cyber. With Dino, I hope to dig deeper into how application security risks and in general, security risks play an important role in business partnerships and how they could actually affect the success or not of business partnerships. After all, the reasons we get into business partnerships is to drive the 1 + 1 = 3 opportunity for two companies involved in the partnership. And how are these partnerships then manifested in the software world? These partnerships manifest themselves through product and application integrations. And I think it'll be an interesting conversation and challenge to explore this topic of security, in particular application security with Dino, knowing full well that security is still considered a checkbox item in business-to-business partnerships. Well, more on that later. First, let's jump into this month's application security statistics and have a look at how the state of application security has shaped up in the last month or so. First up is window of exposure. We track the window of exposure metric over a rolling 12-month period. And as such, we do not expect to see a dramatic change month to month. Having said that, the window of exposure is a stark reminder that the state of application security remains dire. This month's data, unfortunately, tells us more of the same. The manufacturing vertical, it has been a subject of our conversation for the last 2 months, continues to be severely affected, with approximately 70% of the applications in the vertical having a window of exposure of a full year. In other words, 70% of applications in manufacturing have at least one open, serious, exploitable vulnerability throughout the year. Now, the challenge here is that with the increased proliferation of OT and IoT devices, these vulnerable applications will inadvertently open up the connected OT and IoT systems for attacks. And that's the reason why it's critical for us more than ever to pay close attention to the applications in the manufacturing vertical. On the other hand, we do find that financial applications, the applications in the financial sector, continue to have about 40% of the applications with a window of exposure of a year. In other words, 40% of the applications within the financial sector have at least one serious exploitable vulnerability open throughout the year. While that is a large percentage of applications with a high window of exposure, we also know that there is increasing regulator pressure and the fact that direct end users are involved, resulting in the financial sector paying close attention to at least identifying the risks from applications and then taking proactive steps to mitigate those risks. Next, let's take a look at what kind of vulnerabilities we're finding in the applications that we service in a 3-month rolling window. These are the top 5 vulnerability classes that we keep a track on as we scan applications and test them for vulnerabilities over a period of time. In the last 3 months, the top 5 vulnerability classes are as follows. Top of the list is information leakage, and we're going to talk a lot about information leakage today. Second, insufficient transport level protection. Third, insufficient session expiration, followed by cross-site scripting, and finally, content spoofing. Starting last month and hopefully going into the next few months as well, we will be examining these vulnerability classes with respect to the OWASP Top 10. Now, the OWASP Top 10 is a pretty popular classification of vulnerabilities, and we feel it's only right that we map our findings back to OWASP Top 10 and make the OWASP Top 10 more actionable and more relevant for our listeners. In doing so, last month we reviewed A6, the vulnerability classification A6, which is security misconfiguration. This month, we're going to do a deep dive on the information leakage vulnerability in our top 5, which maps back onto A3 within the OWASP Top 10. Before we get any further, let me bring Zach in and ask him to explain what the A3 classification in the OWASP Top 10 entails.
The A3 classification in the OWASP Top 10 is related to sensitive data exposure. It's quite a big grouping of potential vulnerability classes, and we'll dig into a little bit of details. But I think that when most people think of sensitive data exposure, they're probably thinking about things like personally identifiable information, credit card information, things of that nature. But I think as we'll see when we dig in, it encompasses quite a bit more of information about the application and the application's technology stack that an attacker can leverage in a wide variety of ways. In terms of the white hat vulnerability classes that compose things that we detect that fall under A3, there's really 2 main ones. Setu already mentioned information leakage, which we see on a good percentage of websites. It consistently remains in the top 5. And another one that's a little bit less frequent is cacheable sensitive responses. So a case where the website is delivering potentially sensitive information to the user's browser and not instructing the browser to avoid saving that information in a place that could later be read by a third party. So those are the 2 big buckets of vulnerability classes that fall into the OWASP A3. And I think we'll dig further into getting some detailed understanding of information leakage as well.
Absolutely. Before we get there, Zach, spend a minute talking about the cacheable sensitive response vulnerability. Is that something that can be mitigated through an application level or code level security control, or is that outside of the code?
It can be both. In modern application architectures, reverse proxies have a lot of power to alter the response of the application and add some security controls that are implemented at the HTTP response header level. But in general, the application frameworks and the application code itself needs to identify the responses that contain potentially sensitive information to instruct the browser not to cache those pages, or to also instruct other pieces of infrastructure not to cache those pages.
Got it. And on that particular vulnerability, is it a vulnerability that is only related to web applications, or would you imagine that vulnerability to show up in APIs as well?
Absolutely, this can show up in APIs. It's going to depend on the form of the API and also the infrastructure involved in communicating that API into a particular application. But anything that uses HTTP is going to potentially be subject to caching inside of any intermediate like reverse proxy infrastructure. But this cacheable sensitive response was originally a browser problem in the sense that the browser provides interfaces to allow itself to be instructed not to cache sensitive information.
Got it. Let's turn our focus now, Zach, to information leakage. Obviously, information leakage is our top vulnerability from a prevalence perspective. As we look at all the vulnerabilities we find, information leakage is the vulnerability that occurs the most in all the applications that we service. Now, as you kind of break up this information leakage vulnerability class and you double click on it, it occurs to me as I look at this data that it is made up of at least, I'd say, a dozen or so individual vulnerabilities. And two that kind of stand out in front of me is software number version being revealed, and the other one is around private IP addresses being revealed. So help me understand why these two in particular are important and something that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that when we talk about information leakage, we often don't realize the vast amount of sensitive or partially sensitive information that the applications we interact with are collecting about their users, but also contain about the underlying technologies that those applications are built upon. And certainly when we talk about things like applications revealing software version numbers, applications revealing private IP addresses, or even private internal host names, these represent risks to the application itself in the sense that an attacker is able to gather a profile about the technology stack and about the environment that the application is running on and in. And really, any attacker that is skilled, sophisticated, will spend quite a significant portion of their time doing reconnaissance on the targets that they're attacking in order to understand the surface of attacks and the potential attacks that might succeed. And so while often we'll look at a piece of software telling us that it's using a specific version of an Apache server, or maybe it reveals an IP address of maybe even itself, we say, well, what can I really do with that? But it's really about the picture of information that the attacker is able to assemble, giving them a perspective on what are the avenues through which, one, an attack is likely to succeed, but two, an attack is likely to be extended and I can pivot and begin to take advantage of downstream components of this application.
Right. So these are almost like breadcrumbs that an application is leaving behind, and breadcrumbs that, like you said, any adversary or attacker worth their salt will be picking up on and constructing a bigger picture of the enterprise so they can pinpoint or locate the most vulnerable, most easy to exploit gateway, so to say, within that ecosystem.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's as simple as getting a version number of a software, that being a third-party component, and then that turning out to contain a known vulnerability that I can just look up an exploit for. But that's not always the case. In the example of, let's say, revealing a private IP address or revealing a private host name, if I was testing an application feature for something like server-side request forgery, the application might be in a fairly locked down environment to where if I try to make that application request an arbitrary external IP address or host name, that network traffic will be blocked. And so I won't be able to even really detect that there's a potential server-side request forgery. But if I've previously gathered from the information leakage an internal host name or an internal IP address, well, guess what? It's much less likely that the application is going to be prevented from contacting internal resources. There's an innate trust relationship. And so now that same feature, I'm still testing that exact same code, but knowing, well, here's an IP address that I can ask it to connect to. Here's a host name that I can ask it to make an HTTP request to. Suddenly this vulnerability becomes discoverable where previously it wasn't.
And look, there are pieces of information that a developer developing the software can actually be proactive about and be careful about in terms of not expressing it or exposing it. But things like IP address, these are inferred pieces of information. Is there a way for developers to create controls within their code to prevent the exposition of these IP addresses? Or are these predominantly server level controls that need to be incorporated?
In the vast majority of these cases, these subdivisions of information leakage that are the most common, what we're really looking at is configurations of the underlying technology. So configurations of the web server, reverse proxies, configurations at the application platform level of whether or not verbose error logging is turned on and whether or not those pieces of information are sent to the client application. So we're really not generally talking about something that's in the code, although it's not specifically always the case that the information is being revealed by the platform.
Right. And obviously the fact that we've been able to discover these vulnerabilities, these are, to your point, more infrastructure, technology related vulnerabilities. We've been able to discover these vulnerabilities through I shouldn't say simple, but through HTTP tests that we've performed on applications. So the application, in a way, is a gateway to all these vulnerabilities that exist in the infrastructure. Fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also interesting to note that the types of information, sensitive information that I mentioned that the application handles in the code, right? Personally identifiable information, username information, even session related information. The percentage of those being revealed is much lower, right? We're talking about 0.35% of applications revealing personally identifiable information. So the code, when it's handling sensitive information, the developers who are handling sensitive information at that level tend to know what they're handling, right? But it's what sits around it that oftentimes isn't treated as sensitive information.
Right. And I think therein lies a big perception problem, in my view. When we hear the words sensitive data exposure or information leakage, I think all our minds directly go to personally identifiable information. And the key here is that the data that we have tells us otherwise. This is information that is sensitive from an infrastructure perspective, from a technology perspective. This information, if made available to adversaries and attackers, can create a big SolarWinds type attack as well in connected applications. If you have a subsystem of applications talking to each other, and if you're able to discover what the underlying technology bits and pieces are, there is a massive opportunity here for adversaries to execute a long-running reconnaissance mission and then eventually an attack at the scale of a SolarWinds type attack. Would you say that is a possibility here, Zach?
Yeah, I think you hit on a key mismatch between what we think of and what the data actually tells us. And I think that misperception of information leakage as only being sort of risks to the users of the application is probably one of the things that drives another piece of the data that we see, which is generally low remediation rates for all of the vulnerabilities that fall in this class, right? Even the most critical vulnerabilities that are marked as A3 sensitive data exposure, so are getting around a 50% remediation rate in a year's worth of data. And so I think that understanding of what this actually means and what the potential risks actually are can help drive more attention to be paid to these sorts of vulnerabilities when they're reported so that the appropriate attention for remediation gets placed on them.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's double click on this a little bit more, Zach, because I do think that here, as we start talking about more infrastructure type information leakage vulnerabilities, there is enough information here from a software version number perspective, from a IP addresses that are used point of view. There's enough here that one could pretty much construct a picture of the entire ecosystem or subsystem within which the application is functioning and can create a massive exploit up and down the technology stack. So I'm almost thinking about this being a gateway, if not the gateway, a potential gateway to a SolarWinds type attack manifesting on the application layer through sensitive data exposure.
Yeah, I can think of one recent example where a security researcher, through reconnaissance of some large name tech companies, was able to identify the names and the versions of internal pieces of software that were utilized in those applications. So we're talking about common libraries and frameworks that are in-house to those organizations. And what he was able to do was, by knowing the names and versions of those components, he created similarly named components in public package repositories, and then had those version numbers be higher than the version numbers that he was observing being used in the running applications. And what that allowed was that the next time the developers or the build servers of those applications compiled those applications, for the applications where their builds were in a position to connect to public package repositories, they would actually prefer the higher version number that was in the public repository and thus pull down his malicious package. So it provided a channel of attack where he didn't need to detect some headline vulnerability in these tech companies' applications, but through the supply chain, and by knowing the details of their software, its version number details, get his malicious code inserted into the next version of those applications.
Fascinating. All right, Zach, let's kind of change focus here and talk about another important trend that we monitor on a 12-month rolling window. This metric is called time to fix. And what we see here is that time to fix has gone up by a little over 3 days from what was 189 days last time we ran the report to 192 days this month. Let me be a bit more precise here. It still takes approximately 192 days, more than 6 months, to fix a critical vulnerability that we find in production. 192 days, over 6 months. Why is this the case, Zach? Why does a vulnerability that is found in production, that has been identified as critical, take over 6 months to get fixed? I'm sure there is a lot of back and forth that happens between security teams and development teams, whether they're mitigating or remediating vulnerabilities. In your experience, help me understand what's kind of that interaction between security teams and dev teams that results in this 192-day time to fix.
First, there's the triage process, which can take a significant amount of time, right? Understanding if the vulnerability that's been reported, regardless of the source of that report, is real and what the real impact to the business is. So that's the first thing that takes a non-trivial amount of time. The second thing is ownership, right? Okay, we know there's a vulnerability. We probably know where in the application, in the web application, maybe it exists, but do we really know where it exists in the code and who owns that piece of code? Who's the maintainer? Those sorts of things. So assigning the ownership of where is the appropriate place to fix is another challenge that I hear security teams speak that they run into quite a bit, that takes time. And then I think the final phase is, once it lands in the lap of the owner of that piece of software, the process of figuring out the appropriate fix to that and ensuring that the vulnerability is well understood for its root cause rather than sort of only understood for its impact in terms of the exploit. And then, either developing or procuring a library that can introduce a security control. And then oftentimes when you do that, when you do build into the code the security control, you have knock-on effects where some of the functionality of the application might be impacted by the introduction of that security control. So it's a complex process. And then you also are dealing with your normal release cadence of, when are the deadlines through which you have to get the code fixed, tested, and ready to go out the door in order to make the release. So I think those are some of the factors, especially when the vulnerability that we're talking about is a vulnerability that you are actually going to have to go re-implement code in order to fix. And certainly when we lens the vulnerability classes by high critical risk vulnerabilities, that's when we start to see the percentage of the vulnerabilities that are going to require a code fix really go up, right? When we just look at criticals, out of like the 10 most common critical vulnerability classes in this data set, eight of those are most likely going to require a code fix, or at least when you look at the name of the vulnerability class and you don't dig into the details, it seems like it's going to require a code fix based upon the name of it.
Right. So let's park that for a minute. I think you're hitting on something important, but I do have kind of a counterpoint on this one, and I want to examine this with you, right? Information leakage, right? We just spoke about information leakage. It is a serious vulnerability. We know that. Now, when you think about information leakage, we spoke about how a majority of the information leakage vulnerabilities actually may have nothing to do with parts of the application or data that developers are concerned with or they are responsible for. For example, PII data. So is it likely that an information leakage vulnerability gets thrown across the fence to developers? Developers look at the information leakage vulnerability and they say, look, from these vulnerabilities that were thrown across the fence, I can only fix the PII related vulnerabilities or the passwords being in clear text vulnerabilities. And they actually do not address the bigger bulk of vulnerabilities related to technology information exposure. So is there something there around the perception of vulnerabilities when they land in the lap of developers?
I think there's an ownership challenge. I think that the modern DevSecOps paradigm that people are attempting to implement offers an opportunity to solve that challenge, where if I, as a developer, look at this finding and say, no, you know what, this is actually infrastructural and needs a configuration change. One, if we're in an infrastructure as code paradigm, maybe I already own that code and I can change it. Or at least I have a guy on my team who I can tap on the shoulder and get help with it, right? Whereas in more traditional development and operational paradigms, you'd have to send that off to another team to look at how that server is configured in its production deployment. So I think that's one of the aspects of it. And I think the other one is just sort of like we've been talking about with the names of things, right? It's sometimes hard to get the granularity that you need at the first look to understand the context. And so if you send me a remote code execution vulnerability and you send me an information leakage vulnerability, it's sometimes hard to compare and get a feeling of what the real world risk of those things is in comparison to in isolation. If we take how severe is remote code execution versus information leakage, I'm going to probably lean towards the remote code execution if both of those are on my plate. But like we mentioned, there's those scenarios in which you add pieces together and it becomes more than what it is in isolation. So that hardening, when we're talking about information leakage, is less about the onesie twosies of we found this here and we found this there, as it is the overall picture of this application or this part of the infrastructure as a whole doesn't appear to be hardened because there's several pieces of information that it's leaking either at the application level or at the infrastructure level.
Exactly. Somebody once said, what's in a name? And I think, at least in the cases that we're discovering here, if you don't name it right, there's a high likelihood that we'll be missing these vulnerabilities in an attempt to fix them. Now, let's turn back to time to fix again for a minute. We spoke about how it takes on average 192 days to fix a critical vulnerability or mitigate or remediate a critical vulnerability. I think if you look at the data more closely, it's very likely that there is a small set of vulnerabilities that occur in large numbers and that take a long time to fix. And these are the vulnerabilities that are stretching the time to fix to 192 days, the average time to fix to 192 days. Now, as we look at data, I know there are 3 or 4 classes: inadequate authorization, inadequate authentication, and SQL injection that occur in large numbers and take a long time to fix. So is there an opportunity here for us to look at these vulnerabilities and prioritize them differently to get them fixed sooner?
I think we can kind of take an example from some of the data exploration that you and I did, Setu, when we were looking into this time to fix and sort of scratching our heads and trying to understand why does it stay so long, right? And in doing that, we dug into insufficient authorization specifically and tried to get a very detailed picture of insufficient authorization. And when you look at that class as a headline, you think some sort of access role-based control issues where one user can view the data of another user. And that's certainly in there. There's certainly some of those in there. But one of the things that I kind of had even a surprised moment when we cracked open that class, which had in our data set a significant number of detections as compared to some of the more traditional high-risk vulnerabilities. What we saw was that it was composed in the majority of cross-origin resource sharing issues, right? Where the security control to prevent the JavaScript on one site from reading the data on another site was not being properly implemented, or the authorization was allowed for any site to read its data. So when we looked at that, what we realized is, well, we think this is going to be really hard to fix in general, insufficient authorization. But when we drilled in, we said, well, wait a second, the majority of these can actually be fixed at a reverse proxy level. You don't even need to touch the code. You can just implement a header rewrite to change the cross-origin resource sharing header and prevent, remediate instantly a large number of these vulnerabilities. So I think the lesson that we kind of came to from digging into that and analyzing it was, if you look at your data holistically, right, all the data that you're getting about the risk and vulnerability profile of the applications that you are responsible for, you might be able to find these corners that maybe aren't really corners. There's a meat of an issue there where you can identify a holistic fix, one, so that you can take an action that has a big impact to your average time to fix and to your risk profile now, but also identify that, hey, next time we see this vulnerability type, let's make sure it's not one of these easy to fix ones that we can run a playbook against.
Absolutely. Right. I think the insufficient authorization is another one of those vulnerabilities that are misleading in their name, right? When I think about insufficient authorization, the first place my mind as a developer goes is maybe there's a role-based access control type issue. But really, it may not be the case. Insufficient authorization, like you said, could also point to, and in this case, does point to the cross-origin resource sharing issue, which is inherently more easy to fix than going back into code and trying to fix for role-based access control type issues. Now, Zach, I think we did a pretty deep dive into this month's stats. Let me try and summarize our findings for our listeners today, and I'll also try to summarize our analysis as much as I can. First and foremost, window of exposure, still a big concern. Obviously, window of exposure is a lagging indicator, but still, it points to the fact that a lot that needs to be done from an application security implementation perspective is not being done. So we'll keep an eye out on window of exposure and continue to report on it as the months roll by. We spoke about time to fix remains high, but in our last conversation, we found that when we take a closer look, there is probably an opportunity for massive improvement by looking at individual vulnerabilities. A good example is insufficient authorization, where there seems to be a silver bullet fix to actually improve the time to fix across that vulnerability type and class. And probably the biggest takeaway from my viewpoint today is from the analysis that we did with the OWASP Top 10 A3 sensitive data exposure classification, which also maps on to our top vulnerability class, which is information leakage. And what we found was that when we think about sensitive data exposure and information leakage, we inadvertently think about PII type data. But really, what is being exposed out to the world is infrastructure level details that, when in the hands of an adversary or an attacker, can be pieced together to create a persistent, long-running type attack. And I think our takeaway here is A3 could be one of the dangerous gateways to a SolarWinds type attack on the application layer. And that, I think, is a good segue into the second half of our conversation today, where I'll explore the idea of making application security and cybersecurity a cornerstone and a requirement in B2B partnerships, and in the process, hopefully elevating the topic of cybersecurity in the eyes of the business. In the second section of today's episode, I'd like to welcome Dino Bucouris. Dino is a founding director at Momentum Cyber, and I'll let Dino talk about Momentum in a bit. But let me talk to you about why I reached out to Dino for this podcast. Now, over the last few months, like many of you and like many in our industry, I also have been involved with a bunch of supply chain security topics. Now, in my day job, I get involved with security vendors who we can partner with to either expand our offerings into an adjacent market or in some cases offer key capabilities in our target market. In a way, by forging these partnerships, we end up creating a software supply chain by integrating our products or offerings. And I know that Dino will be the perfect guest to talk about and explore this topic. How should we think about security in the context of building these business-to-business partnerships? Or said another way, could security be the weakest link in a business partnership? Or if I were to go a step further, could security be the biggest ignored risk in a partnership? Dino, I imagine our conversation today will be exploratory in its nature, but I feel that with your knowledge and expertise in forging these partnerships between companies with an intention to solve bigger market problems and I guess eventually to create valuable mergers, you will be able to help us uncover ways to think about mitigating cybersecurity risks in business partnerships. But before we go there, I'd like to get to know your story a little bit more. More importantly, what were the inflection points in your career that have brought you to where you are? Really talk about some of those choice points you had and the decisions you made in your career in hindsight that you think were the most important ones.
Appreciate it, Setu. Always a pleasure speaking with you. So I'm quite looking forward to today's discussion. So happy to give you some background. I mean, I think I've probably a little bit more of a diverse background than many in the security arena. So if I rewind the tape all the way back, I mean, I have a couple engineering degrees from the University of Michigan, and then a bit of a business education from Haas, UC California, Berkeley, where I actually still teach the venture capital and private equity course. But my journey between those 2 points kind of have evolved through aerospace, automotive, medical device. And then ultimately, when we founded and started Momentum back in 2014, is really where I had my start more on the cybersecurity front. So as you mentioned, one of the founding directors at Momentum, my journey kind of took me from, I'd say, big company to small company to startup company. And then when I was still in the engineering role, probably about a decade ago, I was working at a medical device firm. It was a startup company, ended up getting acquired by Boston Scientific. I really was just fascinated by more the kind of entrepreneurial spirit, the venture capital world, and really wanted to get a better understanding of, really how to build companies, how to scale companies, and just be much closer to that side of the market than necessarily kind of working with the large public players that are out there. Now, granted, at Momentum, I'm able to kind of work across a wide range and with a wide range of folks, so really kind of companies of all sizes. But for me, it was just I kept kind of narrowing in my career where I really wanted to play more of a strategic, to some extent finance, but really a strategic role there.
So first of all, Dino, go blue.
Yes, go blue for sure.
And second of all, I think what's kind of interesting in what you just said was as you travel that path from large company to smaller company to smaller company to startup, I think that has an inversely proportional relationship to how the art of the possible kind of continues to get magnified, right? The smaller you are, the larger the role of the art of the possible becomes. And I think that's a good way to set the stage around software supply chain. From my point of view, when a small startup tries to forge a commercial partnership with another smaller startup or with a larger company through product integration, they end up creating, whether they like it or not, a small software supply chain. Actually, I think there's another important kind of way to look at it in my mind, which is when you think about a customer who's trying to solve a problem, however large the customer may be, but when they try to solve a problem in their business, they're almost thinking about that problem statement as a startup would, right? I've got a bunch of tools, I've got a bunch of solutions. How do I stitch them together? How do I make 1+1 = 3? And I think in all of these examples, I always go back to the idea of creating that software supply chain where 1+1 can actually be equal to 3. Now, what I want to know from you is, from your vantage point, where you are trying to bring these companies together, try to make them to talk to each other so that they can demonstrate leveraged value. Do you think about the software supply chain in the same way? I suspect from your point of view, there are other elements of value than just the problem statement that come into the picture.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, there's a couple different ways to look at it, right? So, if you put on one lens, obviously with Momentum, being that we're kind of a broad advisory firm, we might work in M&A transactions. We might work with, companies looking for strategic investments. We might work on more of the partnership front. And we also do cover kind of really across a wide range of cybersecurity kind of sectors. So we have expertise and experience working in anything from, the MSSP type managed service world, where, I think that's a good place to definitely unpack some of that topic, where you may have, the product kind of technology integration and any potential risks that are created as a result of that. But also the fact that you're often dealing with, companies that are integrating internally, whether that's, kind of just in the tech stack or just in their processes and kind of the way they deliver their service. They're integrating a wide range of tools that they then use to deliver services and security to their customers, right? So it's kind of a different way of looking at it, but ultimately comes down to that same fundamental question, right? Is when you start piecing together these products, these platforms, in order to achieve whatever that objective might be, whether that's servicing your customers or just having a more efficient and kind of technology focused platform that maybe weaves in multiple features. You kind of get into this phase of almost like a shared responsibility model, and I think that can be risky. Right. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes if I put my M&A hat on, the type of risk you describe is more of a, confirmatory diligence type item and, less so of like a value driver. And what I mean by that, and maybe this is more of an extreme example, but, if you're applying for a new job, oftentimes before you actually get, formally get the position and begin working, you go through some type of background check, right? Most people view that as a check the box. You rarely will say, hey, my background check came back with flying colors. I think I should get an extra $5,000 on my salary, right? It's rarely leveraged in the front end. And realize, again, that's an extreme example, but I kind of feel the same way when it comes to security risk in a transaction. It's almost like assume that there will be kind of sufficient security controls in place such that it is not a risk that will take away value or that gives us concern. But I think there's less of a focus, and maybe this is going to change, going forward, especially with more kind of attacks that are affecting, third-party supply chains and things like that. But it's unfortunately not as common to think about that up front. So less of a value driver and more of a, again, more, I don't want to call it check the box, but it certainly is something folks do on the back end to make sure that, we can proceed with the transaction, but that's pretty much the extent of it in most of the deals that we do. Obviously, there's no one size fits all.
So I get that. So let's kind of switch over to the other side for a minute. And what I mean by that is when we think about putting together two security companies in a partnership or in a transaction, I get it. Security is not a value driver because we're putting together two security companies. But outside of the security arena, when we think about two businesses getting together, in your experience or from your experience, do you think outside of the security world, there is a chance that product security becomes a value driver in the sense that as a product company, if I'm trying to acquire another product company and I have a choice of product companies to acquire, could security become a value driver in the choices that I make?
I think in theory, the answer is yes, and it makes sense why it should. I just don't know in practice if that is going to be a common value driver. It seems like people will make the assumption, and maybe it's more people take it for granted that security is just going to be baked into the product, and that's something that we expect, and we'll look at that during diligence. But usually, when you're talking about what are the value drivers, I mean, you're looking at the sector the company's focused on, the size, the scale, the product, their technology, their go-to-market, and security's pretty low on the list of priorities when someone is necessarily, again, talking about value. When someone's formulating their opinion on the value of the company, it's it seems like security could only take away from the value, right? So if you had X value in mind, but you find some deficiency in your diligence, then it might, reduce the value or cause you to pause and perhaps look at another target. But, and maybe this is just semantics, but from my perspective, it's not so much of, okay, well, we're going to assess these companies on the basis of their security programs. And, if we find one that has just a really phenomenal kind of security program, we're going to, up our offer, so to speak, or increase the value that we ascribe to it. It just, a lot of the models and a lot of the, the formulas, the algorithms, I mean, all the, science that people try to add into valuation, since, it is kind of a blend between art and science, I'd say it's still pretty nascent in terms of folks who will factor in that security as part of that value calculation, if you will.
So product security becomes a necessary condition, so to say, as you're kind of putting together a partnership, right? And it's not necessarily an absolute value that you can ascribe a dollar number to, but it certainly is a necessary condition for that partnership to succeed.
Yes, absolutely. Without it, I don't believe deals would happen, right? If, part of the transaction will be a thorough review of kind of the security elements, whether that's a product or just overall, the overall security program at the company. That is, it is necessary to proceed, but I don't believe it's a big kind of differentiator and value driver. It's almost, I hate using this word because I don't think it should be this way, but it almost feels like it's just a commoditized view to say, okay, well, we have our checklist. We're going to go through, we'll make some recommendations of things we think you guys can be doing better. But ultimately, it's not. I mean, even just when it happens in the process, you're usually past the LOI phase and you're in confirmatory diligence when you're digging into the cybersecurity kind of posture of the target that you're going after, in which case, just by the nature of where it is in the process, you've already agreed to the kind of the headline price and some of the, details associated with that transaction. So, you would have to have that type of a deep dive prior to even signing an LOI in order for us to think of it as a value driver. And it just doesn't happen that way in the process.
Right. So let's take a slight step back on this one for a minute, right? There are various stages that you kind of go through as you put these deals together. And I suspect many times the first phase is really, is there a there from a leveraged value point of view, right? Do these two businesses make sense together? And oftentimes, at least in my kind of limited experience, you start with a business development proposal, right? The idea that we've got a target market that we think we can pursue together if we join forces. So there's a phase where you do a business development agreement where you might actually have a joint go-to-market. You might actually have a joint product. And in most cases, you actually do have two products that interact with each other to kind of create that use case and solve that market problem. So if you look at that first phase of this entire kind of business development to M&A cycle, what I've found is in that first phase of business development, there is an increased need now more than ever to start talking about whether each one of our products that we're taking to market in a joint manner have the right security characteristics and the right security postures so that we are together creating a software supply chain, quote unquote, that is more secure from the get-go. So is that kind of thinking evolving in the way you look at two businesses when you try to put them together from a business development point of view?
So I think it's evolving, and it's something that especially with the earlier stage companies, right? I mean, cybersecurity, many of the companies that we talk to are, still, seed, Series A, Series B, venture-backed ventures here. So I think it's a valid concern, especially when it's a large company that is looking at a partnership with, maybe a company that's only been around for a year or 2 years or 3 years. I think it's necessary, to factor that in. Just like you should be factoring in, questions like, will this company continue to exist 2 years from now, right? It's just the nature of dealing with partnerships of these early stage ventures. I do believe that you'll have more of those security questions and more of that mind frame when deciding on a security partner or deciding on the proper product and supplier, if you will. And I think there's probably more of a programmatic review, and this is my speculation here, but I believe there's a more programmatic review of security up front when looking at just the supply chain for programs of kind of internal use or potential partnerships than, believe it or not, even on the M&A front. Again, the M&A discussions that happen at that corp dev level and that senior management level, you're usually well down the path of getting a deal done before you really spend time to dive deep into the kind of the workings of the platform and the product from a security perspective, right? I'm just thinking about even our preliminary diligence type discussions that we typically have on the M&A front. It's just not a factor. But I do know that when it comes to deciding on a partner or going through whatever the internal security review process would be in order to start using a product internally. And again, I think this is changing. Unfortunately, the whole SolarWinds Orion issue that we all experienced and saw over these past few months, I do believe it's kind of increased scrutiny and focus on this. But I would say it feels like there's a difference on using the kind of the partnership or internal use lens versus the M&A lens.
So let's dig a little deeper on that. I think because what you're pointing out is that on one hand, security is seen as a checkbox, but on the other hand, security is also almost an existential feature, right? Like you said, you should be thinking about whether this business will exist in 2 years or now. That's pretty much the same level of scrutiny at some level you need to think about when you think about security. So there is kind of, it's a bit diabolical, right? On one hand, we say it's a checkbox, but on the other hand, we all know and feel that it's an existential kind of feature that needs to be there in the products that we build. So if I were to double click on that and think about kind of the nature of products that we're building today, almost entirely the focus is on software as a service, cloud-based, cloud-native applications. And the application has really become your product as everything has become more software-defined. So I do feel that in a way, when you think about security, application security is really what you're talking about when you think about product security. Would you also think about it the same way when you're thinking about a business development partnership or an M&A transaction? Ultimately, the nucleus of that whole partnership or the transaction is the product, is the application, which is more and more cloud-based, cloud-native, available in a software as a service manner.
Yeah, I would agree with that from a security perspective. I think from our point of view, as far as looking at successful partnerships, it expands beyond just the products. Oftentimes, the folks that we work with are very much focused in the go-to-market motion. They're looking at the target customers you go after, the size, the stakeholder, who do you sell to, like I said, the sales motion. they're looking at the overall scale of the business that we're looking at potentially partnering with or acquiring. And when it comes to the product and technology, I would say you're spot on in terms of that application centric view. But when it comes to just the overall partnership or the overall deal that we're thinking about, it extends past even the technology itself.
Absolutely. No, that makes perfect sense. And in that kind of go-to-market view of the world, I do think that there is, and this probably comes back to the value conversation again, I do think that there is an opportunity here where why is this particular partnership better than any other partnership out there? Because one of the biggest concerns that our customers have is the security of the data and the information that they hold. And if a partnership was able to evidence the fact that by bringing these two value propositions together, not only have we created a higher level value proposition, but we've also created an element of security in that interaction. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I would agree completely.
So let's kind of turn this conversation around to an idea or two that I'd like to tease out with you, something that we can leave our audience with, right? I'm sure you've seen hundreds of these transactions. And I, for one, know that in the last decade or more, every quarter or every couple of quarters, I get an urgent request to perform a security assessment or to produce a report that describes what kind of compliances are we adhering to, whether a particular application has gone through application security or not. And many of these requests are because the organization is trying to build a new partnership or is trying to explore an M&A opportunity that's on the horizon. From your experience, as you have kind of seen these transactions and facilitated many of these transactions, what's been your experience? Where do you find gaps in the way organizations deal with product security and security requests in general? What I want to try and tease out here is if we were to assume that the way forward from here is one where business partnerships are key to defining our success, what should be the things that we should be doing as product organizations to make sure that we're doing enough from a security perspective that we make these partnerships, these M&A transactions easier in the future?
Well, I think from a risk mitigation perspective, it's probably a natural extension, hopefully not too repetitive of some of the topics we've already touched on. It's more about how do we proactively think about security and factor it into the decision-making process. I would venture a guess that oftentimes these requests that come into you as an urgent item, it's, it is so urgent because it probably is coming at the tail end of a discussion, or we need to quickly do that assessment in order to move on to the next phase of the process. But maybe it's different for let's say what the work that you do there, at White Hat or NTT. But in general, it seems like these are again more of check the box type requests, or these are gates per se that we need to pass to get to the next phase of the process, which hence drives quite a bit of urgency, and less so that the output of the analysis that you do will somehow end up driving the discussion around value and will somehow influence the price in some fashion, right? Unless you find something concerning, I'm willing to bet that it's a criteria. And if you're doing an assessment against 5 players, then of course the security assessment is going to be important. But I'd argue that many folks will probably be doing this at a later stage in the process, and they're not as proactive as they might. Maybe they should be. That's commensurate with the level of risk they're potentially, taking on by getting into this integration or transacting and actually integrating these products even on an M&A front.
So one of the things, it's kind of interesting the way you kind of laid that out, right? It's almost like an afterthought. One of the things that we've been talking a lot about with our customers is this whole idea of making sure you've got continuous assessments in play as you run the business, right? At the end of the day, the threat landscape continues to evolve, and the products and services that you're putting out in the market also continue to evolve. And the only way to kind of bridge that gap is to make sure that you're assessing your products and your services in a continuous manner in production. And where I'm going with this is, I think that in the near future, there will be either compliance driven or even potentially regulator driven requirements around making sure that as you put your software supply chain together, either through partnerships or through acquisitions, you will have to start evidencing that there is basic criteria for security being met along the way. Now, I don't know if you've already started seeing that. Do you think that's going to happen sooner than we all think it will?
It's a good question, and I think it comes down to even just a more fundamental thought that I had as you were explaining that is, today I don't believe we do a great job just assessing the overall kind of security posture of a product, a platform, services, just an overall business, right? I think there's not really a standardized method or a uniform way of looking at the security risk in a business, right? When you talk about financials, there are tried and true methods and calculations and ratios and all the the wonderful work that we can do in Excel and all these places that are accepted ways of assessing financial risk. Let's say I don't believe the same is true when it comes to security. And I believe we're moving in that direction. But I believe that the problem today is also that there's just too many different ways to also look at the security. So one is kind of the behavior and what you're talking about of when in the process we do it, or, is it an afterthought? Is it baked in? Is it driven by regulation? But two also is just the how of how we actually will assess and how do you assign this metric of risk to a business. I personally think that is that's an area that needs work today. There's many different ways you can look at risk in a company, looking at it more from that application security vulnerability perspective. You can look at it from, the companies you're about to do business with or about to acquire. What type of risks do they have in their supply chain? So it's not just what do they do internally, but third-party supply chain risk will give you a different view of risk in the organization. The outside in or digital footprint view, where you might know that a company has X number of thousand of internet-facing assets that have their own security issues, gives you a different perspective. The attacker's perspective, right? Kind of looking at, vulnerabilities of these externally facing assets. But what happens if you double click and let's say you go a layer deeper and when you enumerate that attack surface, if, somebody was successful in getting past that initial gate, what other attack vectors would you discover underneath that surface that don't get factored into these outside in type, security risk rating type scores that you would assign to a company? So, there's a lot of different ways of looking at, security risk and overall security posture. They don't really translate and roll up into one metric. So I think it becomes even more challenging to try to standardize it and make it something that you do ahead of time, because it's such a heavy lift nowadays to do that diligence process, where you typically will want to have quite a bit quite a bit of progress made on either on the partnership or the M&A front before you dedicate, the type of resources that you need to actually properly do this assessment. So I think it's kind of a blend of driving the need for the assessments, but then also how do we even quantify that? How do we even translate that risk to some type of standard that we can all understand when we look at these, potential partners or M&A targets?
I agree, and the fact that this is so nascent makes it so much more difficult. And I think this nicely segues into another topic that's near and dear to my heart, which we'll kind of leave for another podcast in the future. We've been toying around with this idea of CISO 1.0 and CISO 2.0. And the reason I bring that up, Dino, is because we fundamentally believe that the rubric for quantifying this risk based on a multitude of factors does not really exist, right? But if you had a chief information security officer who can start thinking about what it would be like to put two businesses together and think about all the interaction points from product to go to market, maybe not that deeply into go to market, but at least from a services, from a product and from a platform perspective. I think a CISO 2.0 who's able to kind of bridge that gap should be able to guide the company in figuring out whether this partnership introduces a software supply chain risk or not.
Oh, absolutely. I think I think it's even wider of an issue. It's not even just the risk from a security perspective, from a technical side of the business, or like you said, you can kind of expand to other areas, but also what's the business risk, and not even, how do we calculate that or how do we quantify that, but then how do you translate that, right? Because that's the other challenge we see is, most of the topics we talk about, on this podcast are probably not the level of detail you're going to want to get into at the board level, for example. So I think the CISO needs to wear a different hat, and they have to think kind of company business hat on first and foremost, and almost serve as like the transfer function between the tactical kind of security IT oriented mentality that their team will have, somehow taking that, rolling it up into metrics that can be understood, at a slightly less technical level, and then translating that somehow to business risk and having that conversation and that dialogue, at that board level. And I believe I don't know if that's where you were headed, but that to me is kind of where I see the roles and responsibilities of tomorrow's CISO is, they need to be comfortable in the boardroom just as much as they're comfortable in a security operations center.
Exactly right. And it's fascinating how we started pulling on one thread, but we kind of ended up in this conversation around what the next generation CISO should look like and what they should be doing. It's been a fascinating conversation. So a couple of things I wanted to kind of call out again. First, I think I really liked your example of the job interview, right? When you've done well in the job interview and then you run a background check. It's almost a necessary condition, but it's also assumed that, you're going to pass the background check. What I must kind of submit today is from the data that we have, not all applications, not all products actually pass the background check if one were to do so. So I think that's a great mental model or a mental image for I think the listeners to think about when they're building products and when they start thinking about how their products are going to interact with other products and other vendors, and potentially eventually in an M&A transaction. You might have the best product built out, but what if your product doesn't pass the background check? So I think that's a great mental model to think about. So that's one thing that stood out to me, Dino. The other thing, as a key takeaway from my point of view that stood out in our conversation, is security is an existential issue, right? I mean, you have to start thinking about security from the get-go. And when you are on one side of the transaction, when you're finding a potential business partner or a technology partner, I think it's incumbent upon us to start asking for and demanding for evidence that the right amount of security has actually been embedded within the products and the services. And at the same time, there is adequate assessments that your potential partner can demonstrate to make sure that this partnership is actually a successful one and there are no potential software supply chain risks. So I think those were kind of the two big takeaways I was able to tease out of our conversation. Do you think we're on track, or do you think there's more that we needed to tease out?
No, and I think that's a great summary of kind of items that companies and partners, advisors, should really be factoring into their mental models, their thought process, their assessments, if you will. I believe much more work is needed, and I believe we need to do it quickly because the attack surface that exists today kind of in these third-party risks or the supply chain risks or these partnership risks, I think it's grossly underestimated. So I love that you wanted to have a conversation around this topic. I hope it continues to be an area that folks really want to dig into, and areas where CISOs and boards of companies alike pay even more attention to, because I do believe it's a kind of a underestimated risk that we face today in businesses.
100% underestimated and often ignored. Dino, thank you for your time. I think this is, from my perspective, fascinating conversation. I think we got to pull on many threads, and I really like the fact that towards the end we started having a conversation about what I'm calling CISO 2.0. But we'll leave that for another day. Hopefully you can come back and we can have a conversation again around a couple more topics. So thanks for taking the time.
I would love to. Thank you, Setu. Yeah, this has been wonderful.
Perfect. Thank you, Dino. For our listeners, hopefully you found that insightful. It was a very different perspective around thinking about how the products and services that you build today are in service of your customers and in service of the use cases. But when you want to create leveraged value, when you want to create a partnership, when you want to have a B2B partnership to address larger use cases, thinking about security, making sure that you demand that your partners evidence the adequate amount of security has been built into the products, it's an important thing. I'd also encourage you to check out the report, this month's report. It's shared in the show notes. And before I end, as usual, a huge thank you to our producers, Herman and Lauren, who make this podcast an absolute pleasure to do.
Thank you for listening to White Hat Security's AppSec Stats Flash podcast. To learn more, download the report or visit us on the web at www.whitehatsec.com.